You didn't feel it move in. Nobody does. There was no itch, no warning, no dramatic entrance. It just walked, and I mean that literally. It has legs, down one of your hair follicles, past the oil gland, and made itself at home somewhere between your eyebrow and your nose. It's still there right now. I want to be very clear about something before we go any further because I've watched enough people go pale during this explanation to know it's coming. This is not an infection. This is not a disease. This is Tuesday. This has been Tuesday for basically every adult human who has ever lived. I'm a physician. I've spent an embarrassing number of nights looking at skin scrapings under a microscope for reasons that stopped being professionally necessary a long time ago, and somewhere in that process I stopped being disturbed by what I'm about to tell you and started being fascinated by it, which I recognize is not a normal trajectory. Most people hear there are arachnids living in your pores and their relationship with mirrors changes forever. I heard it and thought, wait, how do they breathe down there? So let's just get into it. The animal is called Demodex, 2 species actually, and they've picked different real estate. One lives in your hair follicles, the other lives in your oil glands, head first, eating sebum like it's at an all-you-can-eat buffet that never closes. They are, right now, on your face. Statistically, probably having a very quiet, very slow-motion arachnid evening on your nose, your eyelids, or the follicles around your eyebrows. And at night, and I promise I will explain why, they come out to the surface of your skin and move around. Some of them are mating while you sleep. This is not a metaphor. This is not a horror channel exaggeration. This is one of the most quietly successful, most under-discussed relationships in all of human biology, and by the end of this, you are going to understand it well enough to explain it at a dinner party and ruin exactly one person's appetite. That's the going rate for this information. I've paid it many times. Let's rewind, because breaking in is generous. Nothing broke anything. Your skin let them in on purpose 400,000 years ago, give or take, and never really changed the locks. Demodex folliculorum and Demodex brevis are mites. 8 legs, though the legs are so stubby and vestigial they barely count as legs in the way a spider would recognize. They're built like tiny elongated worms with legs stapled near the front, optimized for one specific job, fitting inside a hair follicle and not coming back out unless absolutely necessary. Here's the part that took me an unreasonable amount of time to fully appreciate. They don't have an anus. I need you to sit with that. An entire animal with a mouth, a digestive tract, a nervous system, and no exit. For most of its life, it just accumulates. Waste products get stored internally in specialized cells, and the working theory, and I'll flag this as a working theory because we don't have direct video evidence of mite intestinal biology, understandably, is that they hold everything in until they die, at which point they finally, catastrophically let go. This matters more than it sounds like it should. We'll come back to it. They eat sebum, dead skin cells, and some of the bacteria living in the follicle with them. Full life cycle, egg to adult, takes somewhere around 2 to 3 weeks. They mate at the opening of the follicle, usually at night, because, and this is genuinely one of my favorite facts in all of dermatology, Demodex appears to avoid ultraviolet light. Some research suggests they're light averse in general, which is why they tend to surface after dark, doing whatever a mite does when it surfaces while you are unconscious and have no say in the matter. You have conservatively somewhere between hundreds and thousands of these on your face at any given moment, depending on your age, your skin type, and frankly, your luck. Studies using more sensitive detection methods, because the old scraping and looking under a microscope method massively undercounts them, suggests that essentially all of us carry Demodex. Not most, not the unlucky ones, essentially all of us. The mite doesn't care about your skincare routine. It has been doing this since before skincare routines were invented, since routines were invented, since before you were technically a distinct evolutionary lineage from your closest surviving relatives. Evolution didn't design your face to be mite-proof, because there was never a version of your face that wasn't already occupied. This is less an invasion and more a lease that predates the building. Picture the follicle as a narrow vertical tunnel. At the top, the hair pokes out into open air. Partway down, there's a little side room, the sebaceous gland, pumping out oil. The mite positions itself head first in this tunnel, usually with its rear end pointed towards the surface, mouth buried in the gland, feeding. It doesn't have to hunt, it doesn't have to chase. Its entire ecological niche is sit in a warm, oily tube and eat the walls. From an energy expenditure standpoint, this might be one of the most efficient lifestyles in the animal kingdom. I have genuinely, at 3 a.m., felt something close to admiration for an organism that solved the problem of survival by simply refusing to leave a comfortable spot. If evolution runs job interviews, the mite's answer to "where do you see yourself in 5 years" is exactly here. The legs, those stubby, almost decorative-looking limbs near the head, are used less for walking across open ground and more for gripping the inside of the hair follicle wall, inching along like a caterpillar shimmying through a very tight sleeve. Locomotion across skin is slow. Studies clocking their surface movement suggest they cover roughly a centimeter or so per hour when they do venture out, which sounds slow till you remember they're doing it in complete darkness, on your face, without you noticing, which is somehow the more unsettling detail than the speed itself. Reproductively, males and females meet at the opening of the follicle. Fertilization happens, the female moves back down into the follicle or migrates to a nearby one and lays her eggs directly onto the follicle wall or into the sebaceous gland. Eggs hatch to larvae, larvae molt into nymphs, nymphs molt into adults. The entire life cycle, as I mentioned, wraps up in about 2 to 3 weeks, which means the population on your face isn't a static colony that moved in once. It's a rolling, overlapping series of generations, being born, feeding, mating, and dying on a schedule roughly comparable to a lease renewal. And here's where it gets, I want to say beautiful, and then immediately remember that most people don't think decomposing arthropod remains inside their pores counts as beautiful, but I'm going to say it anyway, because the alternative is pretending I'm less enthusiastic about this than I am. Remember the no anus problem? When the mite eventually dies inside the follicle because there's nowhere else for it to go, its body breaks down. All those stored waste products held in for the mite's entire life are released directly into the follicle. This is now considered one of the leading hypotheses for why some people develop skin irritation associated with high mite density. Not an active bite, not a sting, but a delayed release of decomposing mite and its accumulated waste, sitting in a hair follicle, occasionally triggering a local immune response days or weeks after the animal that caused it is already gone. It's a horror movie plot structure applied to sebaceous glands. The villain dies in Act 2, and the real damage happens in Act 3. Newborn babies don't have Demodex. You are born mite-free, a brief, precious window of arachnid-free facial real estate that lasts, on average, only a few weeks to months, because the mites are transferred through skin contact, most commonly from a parent's face during the ordinary business of holding, kissing, and feeding an infant. By adulthood, colonization is close to universal. Somewhere out there is the exact moment you personally acquired yours, and nobody documented it, and I think that's for the best. True or false? If you have facial mites, it means your hygiene is poor. False. Emphatically false. Mite density does not correlate cleanly with how often you wash your face. Everyone who has ever had functioning sebaceous glands is a candidate. If anything, some research suggests lower mite counts can occur with certain skin conditions, and higher counts can occur in people with completely normal, healthy, well-moisturized skin, because more oil production means more food, and more food means a slightly larger, slightly happier mite population. Scrubbing your face harder doesn't evict them. The follicle is simply too deep and too well suited for their lifestyle for surface cleaning to reach. This is not a hygiene story. This is a real estate story, and the real estate has been occupied since before you had opinions about skincare. You're lying in bed, lights off. You've washed your face, brushed your teeth, done all the socially agreed upon rituals of a responsible adult preparing for sleep. Your skin to you feels like it's simply resting. It is not resting. As your body temperature settles and the room goes dark, something shifts in the population living across your eyebrows and around your nose. The ones that have been buried mouth first in oil glands all day begin, slowly, to migrate upward. Legs that move at something like a centimeter an hour start covering ground. Some reach the follicle opening. Some mate there, at the surface, in total darkness, using biological cues we still don't fully understand to find each other in what is, relative to their body size, an enormous and featureless expanse of skin. You will never feel any of this. The mite has no venom, no biting mouthparts capable of triggering pain receptors in most people, and moves slowly enough that mechanoreceptors in your skin simply don't register it as anything worth reporting to your brain. You sleep through what is, for an entire separate species, prime time. Here's the genuinely strange part, and I think this is where the story stops being gross fact and becomes actual immunology, which is the part I get overly excited about and then have to reel myself back in from. For most people, most of the time, the immune system does nothing, not successfully fights off off the mites? Nothing, as in it doesn't register them as a meaningful threat at all. This is not immune failure. This appears to be closer to immune tolerance, the same broad category of mechanism that lets your gut host trillions of bacteria without triggering constant inflammation. Your body has, over evolutionary time, made a peace with the mite, not defeated, not ignored it out of incompetence, negotiated a truce so old and so stable that most people go their entire lives without a single symptom. But tolerance is not the same as invisibility, and the balance can tip. In a subset of people, mite density climbs higher than usual, or the local immune environment shifts, and suddenly the immune system starts noticing, not the live mite crawling around, the debris, the dead ones, the chitin from their exoskeletons, difficult to break down and mildly provocative to immune cells, the bacteria that hitch a ride on the mite's surface, most notably one called Bacillus oleronius, which some research has connected to inflammatory responses in the skin, and the release upon death of everything the mite spent its short life accumulating internally. When this tips over, you get local inflammation, redness, small bumps, sometimes a persistent flushing pattern that's difficult to distinguish from other skin conditions without a trained eye. Your immune system in this scenario isn't overreacting to nothing, it's reacting appropriately to a genuinely elevated burden of foreign material. It just took a while to notice, and by the time it does, the visible symptoms can look disproportionate to what triggered them. Airport security that ignores you for years and then one day decides your shoes are extremely suspicious for reasons that have been accumulating the entire time and only just crossed a threshold.
This is where I have to be careful because I want to separate everyone has mites, this is normal, from a genuinely distinct clinical situation, Demodicosis, and it's suspected, and I stress suspected because this remains an active area of research, relationship to rosacea. Known, people with rosacea, particularly the papulopustular subtype, tend on average to have significantly higher Demodex densities than people without rosacea. Strong evidence, elevated mite density is associated with and often correlates in severity with rosacea symptoms in many studied populations. Likely, the relationship involves some combination of elevated mite load triggering or amplifying an inflammatory cascade, plus the Bacillus oleronius bacteria carried by the mites contributing antigens that provoke immune activation. Hypothesis, not established fact, that Demodex is a primary cause of rosacea, rather than an opportunistic bystander that thrives in skin already predisposed to inflammation and multiplies because the environment favors it. This is genuinely unresolved. It might be closer to a vicious cycle. Inflamed skin creates conditions mites exploit, and mite byproducts worsen inflammation rather than a simple one-directional cause and effect. Unknown exactly why some people cross into Demodicosis and others carry the same organism in similar numbers without a single visible symptom for their entire lives. Genetics, baseline immune regulation, and skin barrier differences are all suspected contributors. None of them fully explain it yet. I bring this up not to alarm anyone currently reading this while absent-mindedly touching their own face, a reaction I have caused in myself more times than I'd like to admit while writing about my own subject matter, but because it's a genuinely elegant example of how normal and disease aren't always separated by presence or absence of an organism. Sometimes they're separated by density, by timing, by whether an ancient truce happens to be holding this particular week in this particular person. A large body of studies using skin surface biopsy and follicular sampling methods, techniques considerably more sensitive than older scraping methods, have found Demodex prevalence approaching universal in adult populations, with density generally increasing with age. Older adults, on average, tend to carry higher mite loads than younger adults, likely reflecting decades of cumulative colonization opportunity, plus age-related changes in sebum production and skin turnover. Historically, Demodex was first described in the 1840s, making it one of the longer-known human-associated organisms in dermatology, and yet public awareness of it remains remarkably low, considering it's more consistently present on the average adult face than almost any other organism you could name. It has been quietly living on essentially every human face for the entirety of recorded medical history, described in textbooks, studied in labs, and almost entirely absent from casual conversation right up until someone decides to make a video about it. Here's the part that I think is the most interesting intellectually in this entire topic. You cannot and should not try to eliminate your mites. Not it's difficult, not current technology falls short, you genuinely don't want zero Demodex. There's no strong evidence that a mite-free face is a healthier face, and given how thoroughly integrated this organism is into normal human skin ecology, wiping it out entirely isn't really an achievable or clearly beneficial goal with any currently available treatment. Treatment, when it's needed, isn't aimed at eradication, it's aimed at reduction, bringing an elevated population back down toward the ordinary, tolerable baseline that essentially every other human face is quietly running on. Topical treatments containing ivermectin, metronidazole, or tea tree oil derivatives can meaningfully lower Demodex density in people with Demodicosis-associated symptoms, and this reduction often correlates with symptom improvement. But the goal has never been zero. The goal is normal, and normal for this particular organism includes its presence. This is honestly a pretty good metaphor for a decent amount of modern medicine. We don't sterilize the gut microbiome and call it a win. We don't try to eliminate every bacterium on the skin. The body isn't a clean room that got contaminated. It's an ecosystem that got a little unbalanced, and the fix is rebalancing, not scorched earth. My professors spent years trying to get this into my head before I actually believed it. The goal usually isn't no organisms. The goal is the right organisms in the right numbers doing the right amount of nothing. Fast fact. Some researchers have proposed, only partly joking, that Demodex might function as a kind of ecological keystone species on human skin, one that, by occupying the follicle and quietly consuming excess sebum and dead cells, may actually limit space and resources available to more harmful microorganisms. This remains speculative and far from proven, but it's a reminder that parasite and harmless, and even possibly marginally helpful, aren't always mutually exclusive categories. Biology rarely hands you a clean villain. Zoom out for a second, because I think this is where the story earns its ending. Every square centimeter of your face is a tiny, ongoing negotiation between three parties who've never met and never will: your skin cells, which are constantly producing oil and shedding and replacing themselves; your immune system, which is patrolling and deciding moment to moment what counts as a threat worth escalating; and an entire population of eight-legged organisms, distant cousins of ticks and spiders, quietly living out generation after generation in the space between. None of them are enemies in any meaningful sense. The mite isn't trying to hurt you. It has no concept of you at all, no awareness that it's living on a person rather than simply inside a favorable tube of skin. Your immune system isn't failing by ignoring it. It's making a calculated, evolved decision that this particular tenant is worth the rent. And your skin isn't being invaded. It's doing what skin has always done, which is host an entire invisible neighborhood it never asked for, and for the most part, never needs to worry about.
This is true of far more of your body than most people realize. You are, right now, more ecosystem than individual, walking around under the impression that you're one thing when you're actually a coordinated coalition of your own cells and several trillion passengers who've been riding along since before you were born, and will in some form outlast the current version of your face. I find this more comforting than upsetting for what it's worth. Somewhere along the way in medical training, you either become deeply unsettled by how much of you isn't really just you, or you make peace with it and start finding the whole arrangement sort of charming. I picked the second option. It's been a better decade for me than the alternative would have been. Here's what I actually want you to walk away with, because there are mites on your face is a fun fact and a slightly upsetting mental image, but on its own, it's not useful. Useful is different. Useful is this. 1. Having Demodex is not a hygiene failure, and it's not a diagnosis. It's closer to having intestinal bacteria, a universal, largely beneficial or neutral feature of being a human with skin, not evidence that you did something wrong. 2. If you notice persistent facial redness, small bumps that don't behave like typical acne, or a flushing pattern that doesn't resolve with standard treatments, that's worth mentioning to a dermatologist specifically, not because mites are dangerous, but because elevated Demodex density is treatable, and a lot of people spend years managing symptoms with the wrong approach because nobody considered mite density as a contributing factor. 3.
Do not attempt to eliminate your mites with aggressive at-home scrubbing, harsh exfoliants, or anything marketed as a mite-killing miracle product without medical guidance. You'll damage your skin barrier long before you meaningfully reduce a population that lives too deep in the follicle for surface treatments to reach anyway. And even if you could wipe them out, there's no evidence that's a goal worth pursuing. 4. The next time someone tells you humans are somehow separate from nature, above it, cleaner than it, you now have a very specific, very literal rebuttal locating directly on their eyebrows. Medicine, the deeper you go into it, stops being frightening and starts being almost absurdly logical once you understand the rules underneath it. Nothing about the mite is malicious. Nothing about your immune system's long-standing truce with it is a failure. It's just biology, running exactly the way it's run for hundreds of thousands of years, mostly without incident, mostly without you noticing, mostly, and I do mean mostly, fine. I've spent a genuinely unreasonable number of hours thinking about an organism most people will never consciously acknowledge exists, and I don't regret a single one of them. If this is the kind of thing your brain also quietly enjoys, the strange, overlooked machinery running underneath the ordinary version of being alive, then you're exactly the audience I'm making these for. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.